In this video, I make some shapes, drill holes in perfectly good furniture, and get attacked by a wild animal. A couple of years ago, I built a floating TV console for our living room. It's worked pretty well, but I've had an ongoing problem with it. I didn't add any good ventilation for the Xbox, and it was overheating. Since I upgraded to the Xbox X, it doesn't get hot enough to shut down like the old one did, but still gets pretty warm, and the fan is always kicking into high gear. I could just open the doors on the console, but then our cats like to climb in there because it's nice and warm. So, about a year ago, I started playing with Kumiko, which is a centuries old Japanese woodworking technique for making intricate geometric patterns and shapes. I used that to change out the console doors to provide some ventilation, while still hiding the stuff on the inside. It helped, but it wasn't quite enough. The fan still has to kick into high gear when playing more graphic intense games, and it gets pretty loud. So I'm going back to Kumiko to add some vents in the top of the console, which will mean cutting some large holes in an otherwise perfectly fine piece of furniture. If I screw those up, the console will be pretty much ruined. But we'll get to the console in a bit. First, I need to make the Kumiko vents that I'll inlay into the top. You just saw me cutting some strips of basswood? No, basswood. Anyway, cutting them into 1/8 inch thick strips. These strips will make up the grid work and then the infill pieces of the design. So I switched to a saw blade that's also 1/8 inch thick. And I get out my crosscut sled and jig that I use specifically for cutting these types of grids. So I'm going to make a triangular grid that will be held together with a three-way lap joint. That means cutting two different strip patterns. The first one has two cuts on either side that are 1/3 of the way through the strip. Then the corresponding piece has only one cut on one side that is 2/3 of the way through the strip. A little test fit to make sure everything fits nice and tight. Each joint gets two of the single cuts and one double cut. When everything goes to plan, there aren't any gaps and the pieces sit nice and flush with each other. Now I can cut the actual grid pieces. I use the aluminum stop to hook each cut onto so that my grid spacing is nice and even. Once those pieces are done, I can assemble the grid. Truly traditional Kumiko masters make joints that fit together perfectly, so they don't use glue. I'm clearly no master, and I'm not taking any chances on this thing falling apart, so I'm using glue. Just a little applied with this tiny makeup brush in each joint. And while those dry, I can start cutting the pieces to fill the grid in. I cut them to rough length on the table saw, again using my Kumiko sled. The ends will need to be trimmed to specific angles to fit into the grid, and since I'll be using a chisel to do that, I took a minute to make sure it was nice and sharp. These are just some tempered glass plates with high grit sandpaper. That little sharpening jig helps me keep a consistent angle. I'm just touching up the micro bevel on the end of this, so it doesn't take much, just a few passes and a final stropping. I'm going to use the same pattern that I used in the console doors, so I need to cut a 30-degree bevel on one end of these pieces and a 60-degree bevel on the other end. To make sure I get the angles right every time, I use these Kumiko jigs. The ends are cut to the angles I need, and they have an adjustable stop block to help me dial in the right length. I shave off one side, flip it over, and shave off the other side. Then I can move to the 60-degree jig and cut the other end the same way. Once I have three pieces for one grid section, I can test the fit. These were just a bit too tight. I could make them fit, but that could distort the grid. I adjusted my jig to make it just a little shorter. Just this small amount almost made them too short because I have to cut all three the same length. They went in a little too easily this time, but they still held, even without the glue yet. Once all 48 pieces are glued in, I give them a light sanding to make sure everything's nice and flat. Then I cut off the excess from the edges. Now I just need to clear out the console before I make a huge mess in here. And the TV's got to go because I need to make room for the jigsaw and the router. Okay, see, this is what I'm dealing with. This is why I have to learn how to recreate ancient Japanese woodworking just to keep the cat out of my stuff. And just head off a few questions. His name is Nandor the Relentless. There's nothing wrong with his tail. He's a Manx, and he was born that way. Yes, he is as bad as he is orange. Okay, back to work. I'm marking out where to cut these holes in the top of the console. I'm also going to mark a line on the inside about 1/8 inch, the thickness of my Kumiko strips. I'm going to cut these holes in 2 passes, and I want to leave a small ledge for them to sit on so they have some support when that bad cat comes running across them. Okay, now I've done it. The point of no return. I cut out the rough shapes with my jigsaw, and now I've revealed my dirty little secret. This console is just MDF with walnut veneer, and man, this stuff makes a mess. But it cuts really easily, and it's super stable and flat, so pros and cons. I'm using some thin plywood to create a template around the diamond shape of the Kumiko vents. Then I'll use this plush trim bit to cut around the side and clean them up. The bearing will ride on the side of the plywood and give me nice straight edges. Then I get to cut the second one, same as the first, and clean up yet another giant mess. Now that I've established that inside edge, I can reset my template pieces to cut out for the exact shape of the vents, making sure everything is nice and tight. I forgot to film it, but I've switched to this smaller templating bit. Since it's exactly 1/2 inch long, it won't cut all the way through the MDF like the last one, and it will leave that support ledge that I'm wanting. Round bits usually leave round corners, so I just need to clean them up with a chisel. A quick spray of shellac to finish off these pieces before I set them in. The fit on this was really tight, and I'm really happy with the way they turned out. And I didn't ruin my TV console, so that's a plus. Thanks for watching. See me in the next one.